Good evening and welcome. I'm Mimi Willard, President of the Coalition of Sensible Taxpayers. Thank you, Susan. And on behalf of cost directors, volunteers, and our over 1,500 supporters and allies, we welcome you tonight to hear from our guest speaker, David Crane from Govern for California. I want to start just with a few introductory comments about who we are at the Coalition of Sensible Taxpayers hosting your event tonight. We have been, Govern for California has been characterized as a special interest for the general interest. And when I heard that, I thought, wow, that's exactly what we are trying to do at the local level with cost. We are a not-for-profit, transpartisan coalition. Our overarching goal is to ensure that taxpayer voters have a seat at the table and that our interests get priority. The Marin IJ has described us as a budget hawk. We take that as a compliment. We do deep dive research into the numbers, and then we insist on sensible spending priorities, transparency, and fair process. We're a new kind of taxpayer alliance. We're not associated with a political party. We are united around trying to protect the affordability of Marin for people who live there now as far as their taxes and fees on essential services are concerned. We are not reflexively anti-tax. We believe in sensible taxes and fees that support vital services, with the caveat that every effort should be made for those to be fair, affordable, and arrived at via a transparent process. I think that we have gained some respect for the fact that we do an in-depth evaluation of the pros and cons of proposed taxes and fees using clear criteria, and they are laid out in one of the handouts in your packet. So all of this takes a dedicated cadre of people who are all volunteers with expertise in finance, research, writing, and communications. And so I want to just introduce a few of the people who make this all possible. Our directors, they do the heavy lifting. I'm one, and if you can stand up and be recognized, Doug Kelly. Yay, Doug. Laura Epple. Karsten Anderson. And not with us because he's in France tonight, Paul Primo. Somebody's got to do it. We also get valuable support from an advisory board and some really energetic volunteers and the ones who are with us tonight are, I'll read them off and they can stand up, Julia Labaroni, Hutch Turner, Carl Spurzum, John Peroulis, Susan Kirsch, and Mike Popovich. So here's why we're all here tonight, and we've got a very diverse crowd. We're looking together, I think, for solutions and alternatives to Sophie's Choice. We're constantly given the choice between higher taxes and falling public services. So we want to take tonight an expert look at the problem, which is why we have David Crane with us. And then we hope to have a grown-up discussion among the key stakeholders here about what it is we're going to do. And we hope that you will engage in that during the question and answer time. We have an impressive roster of people. They're listed in your handout, and they are taxpayer voters, elected officials, public administrators, philanthropists, fundraisers, policy gurus, consultants, and citizen activists. Now I'm going to segue towards our speaker. I'm mentioning that I have been very, very fortunate to have crossed paths in my work with cost paths with Ken Broad, who will be introducing our speaker tonight. Ken is just an exceptionally thoughtful, well-read, and informed advocate for the kinds of changes that we need to make for the public good. He shares cost concerns about the challenges that we face at the local level, and importantly, Ken has been a bridge for us to the key thinkers and doers at the state and national level with whom he's closely involved. Important among these is David Crane, and Ken's been instrumental in bringing David Crane before us tonight. So join me, please, in welcoming Ken, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you all for coming. This is an incredibly diverse audience. It's really amazing. Paula Reynolds, who is a huge community activist, could not be here tonight, but said she looked at the RSVP list and said you could negotiate world peace with the audience that we have here. So I just wanted to call a few people out. Mary Jane Burke, the superintendent for the County of Education. Stephanie Moulton-Peters, right here, the Mill Valley Mayor. Someone you may not know is Arun Ramanathan. He's CEO of Pivot Learning, and his associate Hannah Melnico, and they're actually doing a study on Marin and the pension squeeze here in Marin. So be sure to talk to him afterwards, and just the general budget squeeze. We have Rufus Jeffress from the Business Council, Bay Area Business Council. We have huge contingency from Ross. We have a number of people from financial analyst oversight boards. Anyway, it's a hugely diverse audience. Very happy to everybody here. I thought about locking the doors and not letting anyone leave until we agree on an answer, but apparently that's a fire code violation. So, governance and oversight are paramount when it comes to achieving good outcomes. I've seen that firsthand at Mill Valley School District, which I think does an excellent job with CFAC, the Community Financial Advisory Committee, and the next layer of governance is up from that is groups like COST, Mimi's organization, that really takes a look at tax initiatives and renders opinions. But all the leverage resides at the state level, and this is one of the things that David led me to realize. I think he said you're howling at the moon if you expect to get angry and have things change at the local level. It's not going to happen. You literally can't hold enough bake sales to try to fundraise your way out of the dysfunction rolling downhill from Sacramento. There are 40 senators, 80 assembly members who make up the state legislature. If you don't know what SB 400 is, AB 1469, or the California rule, what that means for the budgets, then it's a good thing you're here, because you're going to need to know what that means. And at the national level, think tanks like Stanford's Institute for Economic Policy Research, where David lectures, and also Joe Nation, who many of you probably know, who unfortunately couldn't be here tonight, but there's a presentation of his that's tucked into the handout. David, just a quick background on him. He retired from private industry at age 50 to go into public service, and this is true public service. He lectures at Stanford. He was the founder and president of GFC since 2011. David takes no salary. He does this because he recognized the problem and he wants to make a difference. There's no economic benefit to him from GFC. In fact, he underwrites all the costs and is the single largest donor. So picture it like a negative salary. He pays to belong. Most importantly, David is excellent at math, and he speaks truth to power with a degree of equanimity that is unusual in today's poisonously partisan world. So you can't get David agitated. He's very calm, which is great. GFC Network, just to wrap up, consists of informed political philanthropists in support of courageous state legislators who put citizen interests ahead of personal, party, or special interests. And I think we could all agree that's something that we could use in today's environment. Very last note, there's a new book out on the New York Times bestseller list. You all know Harari, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. There's a chapter on post-truth. I think we all recognize, at least in the national level, we're in a post-truth environment. It's also the case at the state level, and this is one of the things that David will relay to you. 2 rules of thumb from Harari. If you want reliable information, pay good money for it. If you get your news for free, you might well be the product, even if you pay with your time by being here, so thank you all. Second one, some issues seem exceptionally important to you. Make all the effort to read all the relevant literature, peer-reviewed articles, books published by well-known academic publishers, and the writings of professors from reputable institutions. David qualifies on all those fronts. I think Stanford, we would all agree, is a reputable institution. If you want a shortcut to doing all the heavy reading, Sign up for the email notes from David and Mimi, spread their messages, support both GFC, and cost financially to the greatest extent possible. So without further ado.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you, Mimi, for pulling all this together. This is a terrific event. I only wish that my late mother-in-law and late father-in-law, my wife was born and raised in Marin. She went to Redwood High School. Her parents were very devoted Marinites, and though we didn't always agree on things politically, in fact, they would just love to be here tonight, hearing me talk about things like pensions and tax increases that aren't going to services. Because when they met me, I was young and, you know, a liberal Democrat from my early youthful days, so I only wish they could be here. But I'm pleased to be here, and my wife and I also have a cottage in Bolinas, so we are Marinites. And pleased to talk to you tonight about some very critical issues that are affecting our state. Look, I thought what I would do was tell you a story about how I ended up in this world of state government and what I learned and what I realized I didn't know. So as Ken mentioned, I retired from business when I turned 50, when I was in 2003. I had always planned to go into public service in some fashion. I went into business thinking I would spend maybe 10 years or so and earn enough money so my wife and I, and we have 2 kids, were secure and then go off into politics. I ended up spending more time than I thought. I spent 25 years. Finally, the year I turned 50, or the year I was turning 50, I said to my wife and to my business partners, I'm leaving at the end of this year. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm going to do something in public policy. And of course, immediately panicked, because you know, you've spent 25 years in you're sort of defined by what you do. And I didn't know what I was doing, other than it was the broad world of politics and policy. And completely serendipitously, the recall election comes along. It's 2003. Arnold Schwarzenegger throws his hat in the ring and asked me if I would help. Now, Arnold and I had met in the late 1970s. Obviously, we didn't meet in the bodybuilding competitions. Cruel crowd. I'm from Denver, and a friend of mine from Denver was living in LA then, and he was friends with Arnold, who was dating Maria, and this was before Arnold was that famous. He had done like pumping iron and that sort of thing, and we actually bonded over politics and policy in the late 1970s, and we also both thought we were very funny and all the rest. And we actually bonded in part over a mutual appreciation of Milton Friedman. And Arnold and I went to a dinner to honor Milton in the late 1970s. So for those of you, and I like talking to audiences that are a little bit older because you can remember, the late 1970s were a very fertile time for discussion about politics. I mean, almost every time is. But the late 1970s, Jimmy Carter was president. Maria's Uncle Teddy was challenging Carter for the nomination, which pissed me off because I supported Carter, and I still think he doesn't get the credit he deserves. We can talk about that later, for appointing Paul Volcker to the Fed and saving the US economy, but well, that's our next discussion. Arnold couldn't vote, but if he could have voted at that time, he probably would have voted for Ronald Reagan. The issues of the day were, we had stagflation, remember that? I mean, our children have never gone through stagflation. It was very scary to have 12% inflation, no growth, and we had the Iran hostage crisis and much, much more. And we'd have these debates. Arnold and I and Maria and Carla, who I was dating, became my wife, and a couple of other friends. And at one point, Maria says to me, David, you're not a Democrat, because I'm a lifelong Democrat. And I said, because I was agreeing with Arnold and everything, and she knew that Arnold was probably not a Democrat. And I said, Maria, I am more of a Democrat than you are. Go back and read the 1960 Democratic Party platform that your uncle John F. Kennedy had written, and you tell me which one of us is closer to that Democrat. Now, she didn't go back and actually read it, but is there anybody in this audience that knows the 1960 Democratic Party platform? The #1 issue that year, 1960? Thank you. The missile gap, very impressive. The missile gap. So Kennedy accused Eisenhower, and by extension Nixon, of leaving the United States at a military disadvantage to the Soviet Union. It wasn't true, and it may not be that, you know, Kennedy may not have known it wasn't true, but that was the #1 issue. The #2 issue? Well, but this is a very impressive audience. Anemic economic growth. Kennedy in 1962 was the author of the largest tax cut in US history up to that point in time. Bill Clements, that's where the investment tax credit came from. And the third issue, civil rights. So I said to Maria, that's the kind of Democrat I am. I'm pro-defense at the national level, I am pro-growth, and I'm pro-civil rights. It's not worth discussing here, but at that time in 1980, when Teddy Kennedy was challenging Jimmy Carter, Teddy Kennedy wasn't the same sort of Democrat as John F. Kennedy was. So fast forward to 2003, Arnold and I stayed friends over the years, and the recall election comes along, he asks me if I will help, and I say sure. I become his sort of economic advisor during the campaign. He's destined to win. He wins, I get appointed special advisor. I go to Sacramento with him thinking that I know everything. And I get up there and I learn that I know nothing. It's stunning how little I knew. The number one thing, the first thing I didn't know that every American should know, the legislature is truly a co-equal branch of government. So at the federal level, Congress is Article 1, right? The executive branch is Article 2. At the state level, the legislature is Article 4. The executive branch is Article 5. At state level, so it's much tougher than it is at the federal level, because at least at the federal level, presidents have a lot of unilateral authority, for better and for worse, over foreign policy and a few other things. Governors essentially can do nothing without the consent of 41 people in the Assembly and 21 in the Senate. As Ken said, there are 80 in the Assembly and 40 in the Senate. The majority is 41 and 21. And to do anything meaningful, you need 41 and 21. And you don't even know all their names. And you discovered that there are 3 groups that know all their names. Group number 1 are government employees and healthcare corporations, because together they collect about 70 cents of every dollar the state spends. So this year the state will spend our state will spend about $300 billion, including federal funds. Roughly 70 cents of every dollar will go either to a government employee or to a healthcare corporation. We will spend $100 billion alone on Medicaid. 1 out of 3 Californians is on Medicaid. And we're spending $100 billion of that $300 billion on that. Those healthcare corporations and the government employees will know the names of every legislator, and you would too if you were collecting that kind of money. Take the California prison guards. This year, your state, our state, will spend $8 billion on the compensation and benefits on 57,000 employees who are supervising only 127,000 inmates. So let me say that again. We will spend $8 billion, and that's cash basis. States are allowed to use cash basis accounting. On an accrual basis, it's closer to 10. We'll spend $8 billion on salary and benefits on 57,000 employees who are supervising 127,000 inmates in 36 prisons across the state. That $8 billion is more than twice than the amount that your state, which is funded by people like you, will spend on the University of California, which serves 250,000 students. It's more than twice what your state will spend on California State University, which serves 400,000 students. It is equal to the total amount the state will spend this year at the Department of Social Services in a state where 1 out of 5 people live under the poverty level. That legislature has, your legislature, in the last 7 years, and the governor, have given those prison guards 4 salary increases in 7 years. And they were already the highest paid prison guards in the country before they got the first raise in 2012 or 2011. If you were one of them, you too would know the name of every legislator, because that's your customer. That's where you get your revenue from. And you can't blame them. You have to blame the legislators for giving them what they want. So that's group number 1. Healthcare corporations and government employees will know the names of every legislator. Group number 2, and I might end up offending some people in this audience, are crony capitalists. There are people who want to use the legislature to put a moat around their business. The Dental Association, again, it's not their fault, it's a smart thing for them to do it. They know the names of every legislator. They have their own legislator. Jim Wood, who represents Healdsburg, is a dentist who used to run the Dental Association, which is the lobbying organization for dentists, and he represents the Healdsburg area. And what did dentists care about? They want to make sure that not everybody can practice dentistry. There are also some laws that allow dentists special rights when it comes to anesthesia, that other medical practices don't have. They know the names of every legislator. The Realtors Association knows the name, the Pawnbrokers Association, the New Car Dealers Association. They know the names of every legislator, and you would too if it could mean an enormous impact on your business. The third group that knows the name of every legislator are the regulated entities or those that don't want to be regulated. PG&E, Southern California Edison, Chevron, they know the names of every legislator, and you would too. So we go up there and learn that Arnold could be, Arnold wants to go up there and break up the boxes and all the rest. Abraham Lincoln couldn't get anything done when you need 41 votes in the Assembly and 21 in the Senate, and other people had their ear. Now, this is a really smart audience. My guess is if I pointed anybody in this audience, and I will do that, to be unfair, this gentleman right here, who's your state Assembly member? Wait, oh, don't tell us. Where do you live?
Mary Jane, she's back there.
Okay. You live in Marin?
Yeah.
Who's your state Assembly member?
My state? Help me out, guys.
No, don't help him out because now, you say Huffington?
Yeah.
Oh. That's a good one. That guy hasn't run for years. I mean, you don't even look old enough to have been around when he was running. So your state Assembly member, as a number of people here know, is Mark Levine. Who's your state senator? Okay. I'm picking on you, but don't worry. Mike McGuire is your state senator. Now, this audience would know 1 out of 100 Californians know the name of their state Assembly member and their state senator. Maybe 1 out of 100. I teach at Stanford where everybody thinks they're brilliant, and you'll be having some discussion with somebody, and 9 times out of 10, they'll be railing about some policy that is a state policy because in our federalist system of government, states are responsible for 90% of domestic services. They'll be complaining about this or that. Down there, it's usually high-speed rail because they hate that notion of it coming up the peninsula. And for fun, I'll just look at one of them and I'll say, I completely agree with you. Who's your state Assembly member? And they'll almost always say, well, Anna Eshoo. And I say, no, not your congressperson, your state Assembly member. It's Mark Berman down there. And I'll say, all right, fine. Who's your state senator? Dianne Feinstein. No. Your state senator. Well, down there it's Jerry Hill. They won't know. Mark Levine and Mike McGuire, Mark Berman, and Jerry Hill have more authority over the lives of Californians, especially Californians who send their kids to public school, especially the 19 million private sector employees whose jobs and wages are significantly affected by the Business and Professions Code. The 1 out of 3 Californians on Medicaid, everybody, all 40 million whose lives are affected by public safety, et cetera, their lives are much more affected by those state Assembly members and those state senators than Anna Eshoo, than Jared Huffman, who's your congressman, than Nancy Pelosi, than Dianne Feinstein, than Kamala Harris, and arguably even the president. That's because in our federalist system of government, states provide 90% of the domestic services. Yet, people don't even know who they are, except for those 3 groups. So Arnold goes up there thinking he's going to fix everything, and he finds out he can't do anything without the consent of 41 and 21. And worse, the rules are completely stacked against you. If you want to swap them out so you can get a few new people in there, the districts are gerrymandered, and they're closed primaries. The primaries means that really the determination is made in the primary. If you live in a blue district like San Francisco where I live, or Marin where you live, Abraham Lincoln could win the Republican primary, and Abraham Lincoln is still going to lose in the general election because he's got an R after his name instead of a D. Those are 2 rules that were stacked against us. So we said, what are we going to do? We set out to change the rules under which the legislature and more is elected in California, and fortunately you voted for those changes. So number one, there's no gerrymandering now in California. You passed the law, we have an independent redistricting commission. The districts are drawn in a more sane way than they were before. The legislators do not pick their voters anymore. Number 2, and more importantly in a blue state like California, we have top 2 primary. And top 2 primary changes the shade of Democrat who's elected from the blue districts and the shade of Republican who's elected from the red districts. And that is everything. Let me give you an example. Mark Levine, dear friend Mark Levine, first time he ran for the state legislature was in 2012 against, is it Michael Allen?
Yes.
Michael Allen was a machine, I don't want to offend anybody here, but a machine politician. He had the backing of John Perez, who was the speaker, and all the rest. And because of top two primary, which are where the top two vote getters advance to the general regardless of party, in the old days, Michael Allen would have won the primary and it would have been over because the Republican would not have had a shot in the general election. Instead, there's a top two primary. Mark Levine and Michael Allen advance to the general, and Levine wins, in part because in the general, he can get support from Democrats like me, or Republicans like my father-in-law, my late father-in-law. If he would never would have voted for him, but he wouldn't vote for any Democrat. But you can get support for people. In San Francisco, if you cover San Francisco politics, our state senator is Scott Wiener. Scott Wiener came in second in the primary. In the old days, he would have lost. Jane Kim was his opponent. Both two progressive, liberal Democrats from the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. To most of the world, they were indistinguishable. To those of us who know state government, we knew that they were completely distinguishable. Scott Wiener is the kind of person who will not be owned by the prison guards. Jane Kim is someone who would be owned by the prison guards. She came in first in the primary, but he won the general because he got support from others in the election. Top two primary really changes blue districts and red districts that way. So we changed those rules, or you changed them. And then the last leg of the stool is financing good candidates for the state legislature. And that's why after we left office in January of 2011, later that year I launched Govern for California, kind of like Teach for America. That's where I came up with the name Govern for California. Because I had not met many legislators who were actually governing for California. The vast majority of legislators that I met were not governing for their fellow citizens. They were governing generally for themselves, and they could get away with it because the only people who were paying attention were members of those three groups, and they were getting what they wanted while the rest of us were not. And so we launched Govern for California in 2011 to finance good people for the state legislature. Fast forward to 2018, we are now the largest financier of members of and candidates for the California legislature, other than the Democratic Party itself. We're even bigger than the Republican Party now. We've spent about $10 million since 2011. We've raised and spent $10 million. We've won 30 of 33 races. We now support about a third of the legislature to greater and lesser degrees. We will, during Q&A, we should talk about how that is changing behavior up there. Let me go to the issues that are the most important to this organization and the consequences of what has happened in California because legislators have not represented the vast majority of Californians. Revenues are way up in California. Taxes were raised 30% in 2012, and the voters renewed that temporary tax increase till 2030 in 2016 with Prop 55. Yet state spending on virtually every service is flat to down. The exceptions are like K through 12 education, which is benefiting from Prop 98. UC's share of the budget is about 14% less than it was a decade ago. CSU's share is about 6% less. Welfare share is about 29% less. Courts, about the same. Parks, a little bit better. Despite this massive increase in revenues, UC is getting this year $3.6 billion. A decade ago, they got $3.3 billion. Courts, from the general fund, the California court system this year is receiving in dollars the same nominal amount it received a decade ago, even though revenues are much higher. Why do you think that's happening? Pensions is only part of it. There are three reasons. Massive spending, increases in spending on pensions, massive increases in spending on retiree health care, and massive increases in spending on Medicaid that isn't yielding better health. Medicaid is a bigger problem than people realize in California. I'm in Marin. I bet you most people here, one of the classes I teach at Stanford, and my co-teacher is Joe Nation, who unfortunately could not be here with us tonight. Joe and I are teaching health policy this quarter. Next quarter we teach California policy and politics. Most Californians, and including Governor Schwarzenegger, supported Obamacare, and Arnold was one of the first people to say, we will take it right here in California. I objected to it. And the reason is because there was going to be a massive increase in spending that would not necessarily redound to the benefit of people's health and that would crowd out spending on other things. And that's essentially what has happened. California, now 14 million Californians essentially are on Medicaid. We've doubled the number of people on Medicaid. We've doubled the spending from 50 to 100 billion a year. The state share of that has gone from, because the federal government picks up part of it, to $30 billion a year. That $30 billion is crowding out spending on courts, parks, UC, CSU, and forcing tax increases. And if you go to any district in California where there are a lot of people on Medicaid, and there aren't as many in Marin, but if you go to Fresno, 1 out of 2 people are on there, and you ask the assembly member from Fresno, Joaquin Arambula, who is a doctor and chair of the Select Committee on Healthcare Reform in California, what's the difference in the health of your constituents this year compared to 7 years ago? He will say, at best it's the same, at worst it's worse. That's despite a doubling of spending in the last 7 years. The reason is, the reason is we still have a fee-for-service system. 50% of the costs are effectively attributable to 5% of the patients who are chronic users. It's not necessarily in the interest, not that hospitals and others are bad people, but it's not necessarily in their interest to come up with sort of permanent solutions for these people because they make more money when they come back. Profit margins at hospitals, including nonprofit hospitals, are up 50% since Obamacare passed. So the Obamacare expansion has had a very big negative impact on spending in California to the detriment of those programs that I mentioned, just the way pensions have and the way retiree healthcare has. And your legislature is not yet addressing any of those issues. So what do you do? Because those issues are very similar to the issues that you face here. I was telling Ken earlier that at Government for California, we're sort of a fan of what Al Davis said when he owned the Oakland Raiders. I don't know if you remember, but Al Davis used to just say, just win, baby. And that is what you have to do. You have to win. It's not enough to know the math. It's not enough to do op-eds or to complain. These things will not change unless you win elections and then you make the people that are your winners the most powerful people in the legislature. And you have to get to 41 votes to reform pensions. You have to get to 41 votes in the Assembly to reform OPEB, retiree healthcare. And the same thing is on Medicaid. And we don't know any other way. I believe you have to do the same thing at the local level. I don't know your local politics in Marin the way I know the politics at the state level, but you got to win. And that means financing candidates. It means learning how to win elections. It's a business. For your opponents, for them, they wake up every day thinking, what do I do to win? You too have to wake up every day. At Government for California, every day we wake up thinking, what do we do to win? You have to do that here. And that is a very tough thing for most Americans to do. I think it's not like de Tocqueville's time. I mean, de Tocqueville wrote about state and local governments and local politics were very important to Americans back in the 19th century. They're not as important here. There's a big distraction in the form of Donald Trump. Virtually everybody here tonight could tell me the latest thing that Trump tweeted, if he tweeted today, but most of the people here could not tell me the name of their state assembly person. Well, this audience probably could, but yet that state assembly person is having a bigger impact on the vast majority of people in California than the president is currently. The president has nothing to do with the fact that we're spending $100 billion this year on K through 12 in California. 6 million students, 16,000 per student. Yet only about half of that money is actually making it to classrooms in many districts. In some districts, like San Francisco Unified School District, in the city in which I live, where there are 55,000 kids, this year the school district will be able to devote only 29% of its budget to salaries for certificated teachers. And that's because over the last 5 years, spending on pensions and retiree healthcare went up 106%. And you ain't seen nothing yet. That's why Ken included this in your pamphlet, a piece that I wrote after we did research on all this, although we all knew what the outcome was going to be. When it comes to schools, more than 100% of the benefit that they got from the Prop 30 tax increase was consumed by increases in spending on pensions and retiree health care. And like I said, you ain't seen nothing yet. So we don't know any other way to do this but to win. The only local thing I can tell you, and then let's open up to Q&A that we participated in California, is the Los Angeles Unified School District races last year, which You wouldn't know this, but in 2017, the most important election in California in 17 was for the LAUSD board. LAUSD is 600,000 students. It's the largest school district in California. It's the second largest in the country. It is functionally broke. By 2030, I think it is, more than 50% of their budget will go out in pensions and retiree health care unless there are reforms. We got involved in 2 races down there because it was a chance to elect a reform majority down there, and we won. And I would suggest you keep an eye on what's going on at LAUSD. There's been a hiccup because one of the reformers, not one we helped elect, who was there before, had to resign because he did something wrong, so there'll be another election in his district that we'll be involved in to try and make sure there's still a reform majority on that board. But that's the kind of thing you gotta do. The turnout on that race was 10%. And the unions generally want elections in off years because they're the ones who will turn out and most people won't pay attention. But we know how to play that game. And that's one of the reasons we won. We used the technology to get certain voters out who would normally not vote in a school district race. For those of you that are in business, you will be able to tell me nuances of your businesses that the rest of us would never know about, would never read about in a newspaper, that are just like what we go through when we're trying to win races. You got to treat it the same way. So with that, just win, baby. Let's open it up for Q&A, and I'm glad to be here.
Can I ask the first question?
Of course.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Ken can do whatever he wants. Ken, by the way, has been on top of the, you all know this, has been on top of these issues forever. In fact, he should look older.
Well, I learned from you not to complain because it doesn't do anything. We need to just win. Pension accounting is very complicated. One of the things that concerns me the most is future returns. I'm involved in the stock market. The future return assumption has been coming down. It's still 7%. Also, as you mentioned earlier, taxes were raised on 1% of the population, which is the most volatile. So in the next stock market downturn, we're going to have liabilities escalate rapidly. At the same time, revenues basically disappear. Tell us what that looks like. I think that's your you ain't seen nothing yet scenario.
Yeah, it is. This is where the governor's math actually agrees with my own math. There will be $60 billion of deficits in the next bear market in California. So Ken just made this point. You know that I should have made this before. 150,000 of us pay 50% of all the personal income tax in California, and personal income tax is 70% of the general fund. And we tax capital gains at ordinary rates. So you know how Buffett says, you never know who's been swimming naked till the tide goes out. The tide, when there's a bear market, the revenue tide goes out in a big way in California. In 2009, the year after the great financial crisis, and I was in government with the governor then, our revenues dropped, even though the economy contracted 3% in 2009, our revenues dropped 23% because it's a highly leveraged revenue system. So you take that, which will happen again. California has not fixed that. In fact, we boosted our dependence by raising the tax rate to 13.3%. A number of taxpayers have left. There's more leverage than ever. And at the same time, you have these escalating liabilities. Ken mentioned the 7% investment return assumption. Under governmental accounting for pensions, they're allowed to use that same rate to discount their liabilities. So and the other side of discounting is, of course, accretion. Those liabilities are accreting now at 7+%. So you have these liabilities growing at 7% a year and revenues dropping 20 to 25%. You have an absolute disaster. And that's why it's worse now than it was even in 2008. Governor Brown, to his credit, stopped additional spending that the legislature at that time would have passed. The legislature is becoming better now. But early in his administration in particular, they would have passed even more. Now it's becoming a little bit more difficult for that to happen. And he got voters to approve a rainy day fund, but that rainy day fund is $13.5 billion, which will be eaten up, just like that, by $60 billion in deficits. So it's going to be very frightening.
All righty then.
So Doug Kelly to my right said he has a question.
I serve on cost, but I also serve as an elected on Ross Valley Sanitary Board, and I think I have a question that all of us electeds are struggling with, which is we have the pension problem that for many of us who are newly elected or haven't been there for a long time is dumped in our laps. We have employees. I particularly, in my organization, think our employees are doing an outstanding job. But we have this tsunami of pensions that exist now, and then our employees are asking, rightly so, for a raise, and so we're compounding the problem. What are your thoughts on the best way for us to address our own problems as elected people?
Yep, yeah, you guys, so here are my thoughts. First of all, I love pointing out to people, or not, I guess I don't love it. I sort of, out of self-defense, have to point this out. This was a very easy problem to solve a little over a decade ago. It was very easy. I served on the board of the California State Teachers Retirement System. Arnold appointed me to that board in 2005. When I got there, I knew something about defined benefit plans. We'd actually had one in our business for our employees. I'm a fan of them if they're truthfully funded. So I get to there, and I ask for the math, and they present the math, and I'm like one of those cartoon characters who's rubbing his eyes because he can't believe what he's seeing. They are discounting, at that time the investment return assumption was 8%, and they're using that same rate to discount the liabilities. Okay. So they're discounting liabilities which are essentially owed come hell or high water by the state of California, which cannot declare bankruptcy and was borrowing money at that time at 4.5%. They're discounting those liabilities at 8%. So they're understating the liabilities like by half. And they're assuming an 8% investment return assumption on a portfolio that at that time was 60% equities, 40% fixed income roughly, which basically translate, as I wrote, it was published in the Wall Street Journal in 2009 or 10, they were implicitly forecasting that the stock market would reach 28 million, the Dow would reach 28 million by the end of this century with using that investment return assumption. And so I just simply said to my fellow members on the board, we have a problem. We are understating the liabilities and we are overstating our likely returns on our assets, but we won't have a problem if we assume a 6.2% investment return assumption and fully fund at that rate and start now. The state senate responded by kicking me off the board because the government employee unions went nuts, and the way it works, the governor appoints you to these boards and you immediately you serve, but then the state senate has a year in which to act. They can either act and confirm you for your full term, not act, in which case you go off quietly at the end of the year, or act and affirmatively throw you off. They acted and affirmatively threw me off for raising a financial fact. And of course, it doesn't take a genius, I was right. If they had assumed 6.2% and fully funded from 2006 on, they'd be fine today. But they didn't, and we have a disaster. So now, having said that, about it was not a difficult problem to solve before, you're gonna have to cut benefits. And it's gonna be a war. You are 100% right that the employees the current employees today are being robbed. That is true in LA, that's true in virtually every school district. And it's substantially because districts are being forced to pay out money for past debts. If you read Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, he talks about debt devouring the future. There is no place where that is clearer than in school districts. So what do you do now? First of all, do you guys have retiree health care for your employees?
Our OPEB is fine. It's our pensions that's a problem.
You say it's fine because it's fully funded?
It's $600,000 not funded, but that's very doable for a $40 million a year organization.
Well, don't forget, it's going to rise. So, and I would just point out, one of the greatest things about Obamacare is it created a great avenue for people to offload their OPEB obligations, which is what the city of Glendale did in California, led by a state legislator that we helped elect named Laura Friedman. And every district, every school district, every city, the state, should all be looking at doing what Glendale did. Detroit did the same thing. Tell the employees, we're not going to cover your OPEB and your retiree health care anymore. You can get your coverage from Obamacare. The pension stuff,
That's right.
There's going to have to be a reduction in the COLA. There's a lot of money in the COLA. There's actually 2 COLAs, effectively. And you might have to reduce benefits for years not worked, which is the way it works under ERISA. So those of you who know the way defined benefit plans are handled under ERISA in the private sector, you can never take away what somebody has earned, just the way you can't take away the salaries you've already paid. And just the way you can say to someone, we're going to pay you a lower salary going forward, you can also say under ERISA, we're going to pay you a lower benefit. You're going to accrue a lower benefit going forward. In California, the unions take the position that that's prohibited under something called the California rule, which is not actually a rule. It's embodied in dicta in a case from about 60 years ago. That's going to be evaluated by the Supreme Court. My position always was, when I was in the Schwarzenegger administration, was that that wasn't valid then. It's not valid now. That the approach should have been, we were going to cut your benefits and you can sue us if you want. But now Brown and the others have decided to wait and let the Supreme Court rule on the MSERA case, which is the Marin County employees case. So I don't see another way out now. You're all going to have to behave like Gina, like the most courageous leader in the United States, the governor of Rhode Island, Gina Raimondo, who's the only non-California candidate that Governor for California supports. And if you check out Gina Raimondo, if you don't know anything about her, check her out and you will see somebody who is truly courageous and cares about something greater than herself.
So I'm going to recognize another question. If possible, I would like to encourage somebody who's in education in some way, whether it's fundraising for education or with the school district or with the county, just because there's so many people interested in education here in the room. Got any takers? All right, then we have general question here.
I'm not in education, but
Yeah.
I'm fascinated both between the constitutional issues that we hear about, but what can the reformers at LAUSD do specifically to address this issue? What actions can they actually take in the school district vis-a-vis existing?
Yeah, LAUSD is one of the easier ones. So LAUSD has a $15 billion OPEB liability. OPEB is other post-employment benefits. That's retiree health care. $15 billion liability. It's 2.5 times the size of their pension liability, which is a massive problem for them. They can get rid of that liability tomorrow. The new superintendent, who was hired by some of the reformers that we helped to elect, is Austin Butner. Austin is a founder of Evercore. He was ex-Blackstone. He served in the Clinton administration. He's an incredibly bright guy who has never been in a position like this before in his life. And he knows the math. Nick Melvoin and Kelly Gomez, who are the two people we helped elect there, know this math. They also know what Laura Friedman did in Glendale, nearby, to get rid of the OPEB liability. That's the #1 thing they can do. That will be a war, and the unions know it. The unions down there are threatening right now to strike. And so we'll see what happens down. On the pension, they will wait for the MSERA case, which is the case that is challenging the California rule. Governor Brown has made it very clear that he wants as clear as he can, without going too far, that he wants the Supreme Court to rule that the California rule is not valid via the MSERA case. And when that happens, you'll be able to adjust benefits for years not yet worked, and presumably the COLA as well. I think the COLA is addressable right now, and there's a lot of money in the COLA. I just want to point out something. The employees who are the beneficiaries of these pensions did nothing wrong. They did nothing wrong, and it's scandalous. And the people that did something wrong should be in jail, and they are the people that served on the board of CalSTRS with me, and they're any state official who knew the math. There are some state officials never understood the math. There are others who fall under that great refrain from Upton Sinclair about the difficulty of getting someone to understand something when their job depends on them not understanding it. Most of the people in the state government were like that. But there are people who knew better. And when you're making promises which people are counting on for their future, and you do not pre-fund them properly, you lie, you're effectively lying about that, and setting future taxpayers up for what's going on in your school districts now, where you're diverting money to retirees and away from active teachers who need more money, is criminal. It's theft. And those people should be in jail. It's too late to get those, but it's still happening right now. CalSTRS is still assuming a 7% rate. They shouldn't be assuming a 7% rate. So they're making promises right now. Your districts are making promises right now that are not properly funded and setting up for future problems going forward.
Hi, yes, Marin County has probably the highest parcel taxes for schools in the state, or very close to the highest, and they just keep asking for more and more money, and I think a lot of it does have to do with the pensions. And how do you tell the school boards that they can't keep doing this?
You got to win. That's absolutely true in San Francisco, where we live. Just passed a parcel tax, it's very easy to sell those sorts of things. The parcel tax, which is very regressive in a city where already we penalize middle class and lower middle class people in San Francisco. We penalize them already. The city has passed a parcel tax, which is, you know, regressive, in order to finance effectively the increases in pensions and retiree health care. The parcel tax will raise $50 million a year, and as I told you before, their spending on pensions and retiree health care went up 106%, which, by the way, was about $50 million per year.
They always tell you their hands are tied and they can't do anything about it.
It's a lie. It's a lie. So the OPEB, they can absolutely do something on retiree health care right now. There is nothing stopping any school district from saying to the collective bargaining units, in our next contract, we are going to disassociate active employee health care from retiree health care, and we're going to tell the retirees they can go get their coverage like from Obamacare, which is where I get my coverage until I go on Medicare at the end of this year. Thank you very much. I thank my children. So no, they can do that. Oh, retiree health care right now, and in my view, gutsy people on school boards should go ahead and reform and even take the risk right now of saying, and we're also going to drop the payments on the pensions to retirees or the COLA and let them be sued. Like I said, it's not fair, but it's not fair to the kids. It's not fair to the active teachers, and it's not fair to the taxpayers who have been picking all this up, and it's entirely because of deception by the CalSTRS board and others who knew the math.
Can you get over there, Ken?
I'll just shout.
Okay, this is
Yeah, it's a
shout.
small room.
All right, I heard you say healthcare, healthcare, healthcare. Retiree healthcare, Medicaid.
Oh,
I mean, it's the problem. Healthcare in this country is the problem. The insurance companies are making way too much money. We need Medicare for all. And there was a bill in Sacramento that was going to be Medicare for all for California, and it was defeated. I don't know what happened to it.
I can tell you exactly what happened to it.
Okay. But that is what we need. I mean, there's so much money going to the insurance companies that there's not enough money for health care.
Well, you're talking to someone who teaches health policy who's going to disagree with you about the causes, but I will tell you SB 562, which is the bill you're talking about, failed because it was a lie. They called it single payer. It's got nothing in common with any single payer system in the world. It had no utilization controls, no cost controls, and the 24-person board that was going to decide what was paid for was controlled by, get ready for this, healthcare providers. So no, don't fool yourself. And when it comes to, and it's a shibboleth to say that we have these problems because healthcare spending generally is too high. That is not true in every area. So the Medicaid spending has nothing to do with insurance companies. That's entirely state and federal funded. There are no insurance companies involved. The retiree health care plan in school districts and in the city of San Francisco and the state of California is entirely because politicians made promises to employees to provide them with platinum level health care post-retirement, even when they're eligible for Medicare. And they haven't had the guts, in most cases, to say, we are not going to provide that for you anymore because it's taking money away from current teachers and current students and current citizens. So no, it's an excuse to say it's health care generally. It is not, and it's not. And there are no insurance companies involved in this stuff.
Ken, you want to shoot somebody?
Wait, one time.
You're talking healthcare, you picked on me, so I get this.
No, well, you got to ask them.
All right.
You got to ask them.
Ken's coming around with a mic.
All right.
Your luck.
So just to finish on healthcare, so what do you recommend? I mean, the one thing in California is we spend less per person than many other states, right? On Medicaid. More people are covered. So what can we do? I mean,
I'll tell you exactly what you can do. Are you a doctor?
no.
What you do?
What kind? Are you a healthcare professional? You're a coach?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, first of all, you can revise the scope of practice laws. So one of the reasons, Medicaid in California in many places is significantly coverage without care. It's nominally coverage. It takes forever for people to get appointments unless they're in areas where there's a lot of Medicaid professionals, but especially in remote areas, it's terrible. Yet we are a state where, because of, remember that second group I told you about, the crony capitalists? Scope of practice laws limit the ability of nurse practitioners and nurse midwives to do things because doctors don't want them to be able to do so. I don't blame the doctors for wanting to keep their moats, but nurse midwives, we are one of only 6 states in the United States where by law, an expectant mother cannot have her child delivered just by a nurse midwife without the supervision of a physician. That raises costs and it lowers access. Nurse practitioners can do all kinds of things for patients in California that Medicaid people could use, but they are not entitled to practice the same kind of medicine or levels of medicine that they should be entitled to practice. Fire stations, which are highly underutilized in California. People that work in fire stations are trained paramedics in many cases, et cetera. They should be co-location services for people that are on Medicaid. And probably the single biggest thing you could do, since 50% of the costs are attributable to about 5% of the patients, is intervene early with cost emergent users. I paid for research, my foundation paid for research in Rhode Island because we have a good relationship with the governor there. Using raw Medicaid data, Brown University did research on people that are big users, they're called super users of Medicaid services, and what you could do with social services dollars, which are much cheaper, to intervene early before they become cost emergent. And they developed an algorithm that with 88% reliability can detect someone before they are cost emergent and address them with social services. There are people in Rhode Island that, for whatever reason, they don't pay their heating bill, and they end up in the hospital, which costs a fortune. Now, guess which, remember I mentioned earlier about the social services budget in California, nominally getting the same amount of dollars as it got a decade ago? That's the budget that is harmed by excessive spending on Medicaid and pensions and retiree health care that should be used to help cost emergent people. So there's a lot you can do.
Just one question, David.
Yeah.
So could you expand a little bit on OPEB? So what would keep, so I get a school board trying to push that liability off. What's the opposing force? Because if you're going to try and do that, I just can't imagine.
Political power. It's the unions.
But why would the union care where they're getting their services from?
Because of the nature of the policy. So if you're on if you go on to Obamacare, you're eligible for Obamacare subsidies up to 400% of the poverty level. You are not eligible above that for subsidies, and the choice of plans is going to cost you more money, whereas you're getting for free, essentially, depending on the district, depending on the city, a platinum plan.
So there's room to make a change in that where you assist them to get a higher policy plan without paying the full plan.
Yeah. What I would recommend anybody interested in retiree health care, go look at what the city of Glendale did. Ken can probably find it, or just come to me and I will send you like an article about it. And they got rid of their liability by just saying, look, and in Laura Friedman, who's a state assemblywoman who she's the Gina Raimondo of California, if you will. Laura was opposed to doing that until Obamacare was available for those people. So
you make a very good case for the fact that we are much more in the throes of the people who are in Sacramento than the federal government. And you also mentioned that it is within the power of school boards to make some of these changes. Why aren't we concentrating on school board elections? Those are cheap. As you said, 10% of the people participate. Imagine if all over California you got reform-minded school boards who did everything that Glendale did.
From your mouth to God's ears is all I can say.
But I'm talking about your efforts.
Oh, no.
So you're trying,
this is
what
a
is
business.
the difference between electing assemblymen and senators to do big changes that are very politically challenging and getting into the weeds with school board elections where it's easy and cheap?
Because you don't have enough power to
changes.
fix all of the problems in California. So for example, school boards have nothing to do with health care. If you want to change tenure in California, which we grant unofficial, effectively at 16 months to become eligible. If you want to make it easier to dismiss a bad teacher, an ineffective teacher, if you want to change those sorts of rules, you got to operate that's the education code at the state level. And there are so many other issues at the state level that need to be addressed. So it's not enough to do school boards. You have to do both. School boards can address the retiree healthcare issue, but they can't address the tenure issue and the firing issue. I think the one thing they can do, you have a superintendent here, she can probably tell us, is pay disproportionate. I mean, Marin is different than like San Francisco or Los Angeles, but pay disproportionate pay to teachers who are willing to work in tougher districts and that sort of thing. I think that the school boards themselves can do that, but so much of it is controlled by the education code, and that's the state.
So I'd like to have a question a little on the other side of this one. I mean, you've given us so much to be worried about, just to not sleep tonight over how bleak the picture is. And her question is, like, it's only the 10% of the voters who come out for a school board election, but could you look at the other side of it? For so many of us who have worked to activate citizens and get citizens involved in their communities or the county or the state, what do you have as suggestions for how do we do more to educate people about what's going on and give them the sense of the tools or the empowerment that they are needed there to make a difference?
Well, my answer is to focus like a laser on one enterprise. In our case, it's the California legislature, and then win. I mean, that's all I know. So you, if I were you, where do you live?
Mill Valley.
So you could pick the Mill Valley School Board, you could pick the Water District, something like that. Know it better than everybody else. Know it. Know what it takes to win those elections. And then it's not enough to win. You then have to have your winners become more powerful. So then you got to contribute a rate. You've got to bundle money to them. So it all, and the rules governing contributions and the amount of money that is needed to make someone powerful. I mean, it's very much about how much money they collect once they're there. There's a reason that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer are the leaders of the Democratic Party. They're in two areas that deliver a lot of money to the rest of the party: San Francisco and New York, which, by the way, did not stop them from cutting deals with pharmaceutical companies and hospital companies, right? Because they collect a lot of money from them as well. You have to make your people more powerful, and you have to liberate them so they don't get their money, they don't need their money from special interests. Sorry, I mean, I'm sorry to tell you that it is work, because your opponents, for them it's a business. For you, it has to be the same sort of thing. You got to beat them.
Hi. So for me, I'm trying to get a handle on the demographic of the problem for me as an individual citizen. I wanted to know, do you have an idea of what the percentage of the population in California is linked to pension plans and these retirement health care versus the population that collects instead Social Security and then goes on Medicare? Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
But it does, but it doesn't. So for example, just because you're a government employee doesn't mean you're not entitled to Social Security and Medicare. Teachers are not entitled to Social Security, but police officers, for example, and other public employees, there's nothing that limits them from also being entitled to Social Security and Medicare. So they're not like either or, except for in the case of teachers.
So you're explaining that to me that the pension plan is on top of Social Security if they collect it.
Except for in the case of teachers.
Except for the case of teachers.
And I don't know about administrators. The superintendent would know probably, but I don't know about administrators.
Okay. So, you know, I can only say from my own personal experience from a Medicare standpoint, I couldn't collect till I was 65. And for the years prior to 65, where there was a window, I've always worked for myself, I had to pay my own health care as an individual. I was part of that Obamacare thing that I was penalized, you too, at high rates, paying huge amounts, not for a platinum health care, but for a huge deductible health care to just get through till I could do Medicare.
Correct.
So when I tend to think of, once again though, I am sort of interested in a concept of percentage. When I think of a population that is entitled to picking up pension plus platinum health care versus what I've gone through, I'm trying to understand, not pointing the finger at them, just who these people are, what do they represent in numbers, what am I up against trying to make the arguments and be an activist for changes?
Well, I wouldn't, yeah, you're right, you shouldn't point fingers or demonize those people. I was in the financial services field. You could, we all went for as much money as we could make. And these employees that are working for governments and all the rest, it's perfectly legitimate for them to seek the highest salary and the best benefits, et cetera. So what you're up against is they've had more bargaining power because they've controlled more politicians. In general, politicians, their incentives, I mean, go check out even Jared Huffman, who is your congressperson, who if I were to ask you, how would you describe Jared? He's an environmentalist, ex-NRDC, very Marin kind of guy, right? Now go to opensecrets.org and look at who's contributing money to him while he's in Congress. Once they're in Congress, they collect money. This is Congress I'm talking about, but it's also true at the state. They collect money from the third house. The third house are all the people that benefit from government. At the federal level, it's very much, pharmaceutical companies, hospital companies, and stuff like that. At the state level, it's government employees and people like that, and they will regularly contribute to the people that are making these decisions. So if you're dealing with the Los Angeles Unified School District Board, where they're going to have a war over these retiree health care benefits that have accumulated, the people historically that have been on that board, their lives were miserable if the union said, we want retiree health care, and if they didn't give it to them, they were out. So it's winning elections and then making them powerful.
I think we're going to go for 2 more questions.
We have 3 more questions.
3 more questions on hold, and then to wrap up.
Okay.
Can look back there too.
If I may I ask a 2-part question since there are only a couple? One is that
you're very smart.
I heard you speak at D'Angelo's a few months ago, and you made the point that there were, I think, 5 categories that the people you supported had to, check the box. I would love you to share that with this room because I thought that was one of the more compelling things that I heard that night. And then I have a question more specific to pensions and education.
So at Government for California, so think about it this way. When you elect someone to the legislature, it's like putting money with a money manager where you have a 12-year lockup because they have 12-year term limits and they're almost always reelected. And legislators assembly people run every 2 years for reelection, in the Senate's every 4 years, and they almost always win. So when you're getting behind someone who's running for something like that, who's going to be there for 12 years and therefore have power over 12 years of $300 billion budgets and every education code and all the rest, who do you want there? We want Abe Lincoln. We want Gina Raimondo. We want Laura Friedman. And they are people who don't even necessarily agree with us on all the issues. They meet 5 tests: intelligence, and you have to understand where we're coming from. I was up there when legislators, Mark Levine is a very intelligent guy, he's an exception, but in general, most legislators have not been the smartest people around. You want people who are financially literate. When I mentioned to this crowd that states can use cash basis accounting, most of you understand what I'm talking about. Very few legislators know what that means, or discount rates, things like that. You want legislators with a legislative temperament, and this is very important for a crowd of people who have never served in the legislature. I don't have it. You cannot be strident, you cannot be argumentative, you've got to be someone who can deal with people and cut deals. And think about it, it's a world in which you want to get anything done. If you're in the assembly, you got to get 40 other people to agree with you, and one of them wants something from you. Then you got to get 21 people in the other house and the governor to sign it. That's a special temperament. We want people who can win. So if you're going to get into this stuff and you got to win, don't just get behind someone because they're a good speaker. You got to pick people who can win. Otherwise, forget about it. And the last one is you want people, we call it courage, who care about something greater than themselves, ultimately. Now, they got to make compromises all along the way. Abe Lincoln had to make compromises. Gina Raimondo makes compromises. But at the end of the day, when something big is on the line, they got to do something it's bigger than themselves. Those are our tests for people we help elect. Now, there aren't that many open seats right now going forward, so we're now supporting a bunch of people in the legislature, including people who we lost to, because we want to draw them over to the reform side of the aisle, and our tests for them are a little bit different. Can we draw them to the reform side of the aisle? And they see the money. They're heading in that direction. So your second question.
Okay, so my second part of my question, thank you for indulging me, is that and part of it's a comment, is that I think it's really exciting to be here tonight where there are people who you might think of as naturally just anti-tax, people who are here on behalf of kids and are working on parcel taxes. I had someone say to me at a Rotary meeting, I don't like the mechanism of a parcel tax. And I said, neither do I. But I keep working on them because it really is one of the only mechanisms that school districts have to bring in funds when we're dealing with AB 1469 and we're dealing with Prop 30 and we're dealing with increased enrollment. So I would love to hear you speak a little bit about, Prop 30 and the possibility of split roll. I'd like to hear you talk about, just sort of the mechanisms, the other mechanisms that we have. And as someone who's going to be on the school board in Mill Valley, I'm also excited to get more educated about OPEB. I've heard some from Richard Tate, who is here tonight. But, I know there are things that can be done at the local level, but unfortunately, it's pretty limited.
Well,
thank you.
my answer is short and sweet. If I were you, I'd get to know the math first, because AB 1469 was based on a fraud in terms of the cost. So they at that time, they were assuming a 7.5% investment rate of return. They will never meet over a long period of time their returns, not even close. And once you fall behind, it's virtually impossible to catch up. So it's a little bit like a mouse on a wheel. You're going to be passing taxes all the time unless you guys can get control of the costs. And you ain't seen nothing yet on pensions and retiree health care both. And so you're going to see increases. You will see taxes imposed at the state, proposed at the state, for sure, especially in the next recession, that will probably shock you. Wealth taxes. Already in the last legislature, a couple of legislators proposed a 17% excise tax on the carried interest. Sorry, Ken. On the carried interest that money managers get. Now, it could never pass because it requires a 2/3 vote in the legislature, and we knew it couldn't pass. But and they would have lost, and every money manager would have left, actually, if that sort of thing happened. But you're going to see so much more. So this notion of solving this problem by adding on more revenue, even split roll, which will make, how much will split roll bring in? $6 billion a year?
Well, closer to 8 to 10 billion.
8 to 10 for the state.
But it grows at a much greater rate.
Yeah, not even close to the rate at which these liabilities grow.
Right.
And not even close to the rate at which Medicaid expenditures are growing.
Preferable to high income tax and to high sales tax.
So, but again, it's not nearly enough. My view is you got, I am financial to a fault, I suppose. You have got to control the costs. Then you got to make sure the money goes to the classrooms, because, look at Prop 30. You have had a 30% tax increase in 2012 and a 9-year bull market where the stock market is 4 times higher. What is it? Four times higher than it was in 2009? Close? I don't know, something like that. It's at 26,000. It was at 6,600 in 2009. So you've had a 9-year bull market, a 30% tax increases, and school districts are in trouble now. So if you think that a parcel tax, or I have no problem paying taxes. I live in California, but I want the money to go to services, and it's not making it to services. You got to win that war.
David, I'm going to jump on the 2-part question bandwagon here. It seemed to be very effective.
Smart, Rufus.
First question, if we're headed towards this fiscal disaster in our municipal governments and our school districts and things like that, why wouldn't unions that would presumably also be victims of that not be supportive of the kind of reforms that are necessary? And then second question I'll just throw at you right now, are you looking at all at any kind of using the initiative process? Is there any avenue in terms of the initiative process for this?
So on the first one, for the same reason that Roger Smith and the management of General Motors in 1980 did not look to the future for their company, so they cut deals with employees to give them unfunded pension promises. Union leaders today are not going to care that much about things down the road. That is just the nature. There's one union leader I've met, and he's retired now, John Hamm, who was head of CHP, who was paying attention to the math down the road. But don't forget, if you've got an obligation owed you come hell or high water from the state of California, which cannot declare bankruptcy and has the power to tax, then you don't really care that much about pre-funding. Now, local employees should worry because they can declare bankruptcy. But school districts can only default, and the state is required to back them up. So school employees effectively have a state guarantee. So they don't have to worry about pre-funding. It's really the taxpayers and future employees that have to worry about it. But do not look for, some union leaders have reached out to me recently to talk about this stuff, about maybe what they can do, and I'm happy to talk to them. But I just don't think you can look to them to make it happen. On, what was your second part? It was, no. You know, the legislature has the power. This is their job. And one of the problems has been that we have let them off the hook too easily by them regularly complaining that initiatives are the reason they couldn't get something done. And that is a lie. So for example, California's prison population, which most people in this crowd and around the state would probably say spiked because of 3 strikes, which is not true. Determinate sentencing, which was a law signed by Jerry Brown in 1976 when he was governor, sent California's prison population looking like a hockey stick. That's what led to it, and that's statutory. That's the legislature and the governor, and it's still technically on the books. 3 strikes steepen that curve a little bit, that's it. Even Prop 13, the biggest problem with Prop 13 was a disaster. But even more of a disaster was AB 8, which is the bill that the legislature and Governor Brown passed not long after that to bail out local governments. And when they did it, it's a terrible story about how they screwed all that up. That's what centralized power in Sacramento. That's what gave unions all this power. Never forget the collective bargaining rights in California were granted by Ronald Reagan and the legislature. He's the one who granted them, and that was all statutory as well. So the legislature can solve these problems. And I don't think you can address cost problems, which is what these things are, with initiatives.
So our last question tonight is going to come from Mary Jane Burke, who is Marin County Superintendent of Education.
Great, great. It's not exactly going to be a question, but what I would want everyone here to know is that even at the sort of the beginning when Prop 30 was coming into play and the decision was being made locally to move the pension costs to the local level, we raised our arm back then. Ken Broad helped us, of course, and I'm sure maybe with your help as well, but trying to frame the significance of that particular move. And as you may all know, you hear a lot about the schools have local control, a lot of local control, and it's not local control to send you the bill without any ability, and you've raised a few issues about ways we could frame this up. But in general, these school districts do not have a choice of whether to sign people up or not for STRS or PERS. That's absolutely required, as you well know. The issue around OPEB is one that many of our school districts are already pre-funding, just for you to know. So we have sort of joined in making sure that we are definitely forward funding. And I want you to know that we, in general, we have employees who actually do get this. So we are not dealing with people that don't have some understanding of what you're talking about. Because in the end of the story, if there's no money, there's nothing, right? And so there's a lot of conversations happening at multi-levels, and want you to know that the trustees in this county, and there's 97 of them, have actually been working over the past several years on this exact issue related to pension. Joe Nation has been one of the speakers. And so there is definitely an acknowledgement. I think that this is a community issue, for sure, and one that not any one agency will be able to solve alone. I agree totally with what you're saying about courageous leadership. I think in general, people that are elected need to be willing to lose their job and do the right thing, right? But do know that in our community that people aren't looking seriously. One of the responsibilities I hold as the county superintendent is oversight at some level for the budgets of our school districts, current and 2 subsequent years. So I care deeply about where these districts are they able to meet their obligations. Someone made a comment about the parcel taxes, and I want you to know that, that the bottom line is that in Marin County, in these public schools, we are able to provide the education that our taxpayers demand as a result of a variety of additional sources of funding. One of those is obviously the parcel taxes. And what we have found is when the community feels that sense of these are damn good schools, I can send my kid to them, that they are willing to support. But what has happened in this political shift with the Prop 30 and the pensions, right, coming down to the local level, is this alignment of, hey, wait a second, the money's going to the pension, not to the arts programs, et cetera. So frankly, what I want, and maybe our focus needs to be on Gavin, right now, is to say, fine, you take this right back. We don't need, you take care of the issues around these pensions. Don't give them to us locally with no authority. And so then we can get back into a different conversation in our community. So I do want to say, it's been very enlightening, interesting to hear your view, and I actually look forward to talking more with you.
Sure.
So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Ken. I appreciate what you have done to provide us tonight's deep dive into the challenges and maybe a few ideas about solutions. I want to also say a special thank you to the donors, to our new 501c3, the Coalition of Sensible Taxpayers Foundation, whose funds paid for tonight's event. And I also want to tell you that we have been given a $5,000 matching grant for donations coming out of tonight's event, and your contributions to the Cost Foundation will in effect be doubled. And our 501c3, the foundation, it's focused on research and education. So I want to also thank all of you who came here tonight and urge you to help effect change. And I think that while we have a very diverse crowd, there's something that each person in this room could do going forward, using your time, your money, or your leadership position. And I'll just share with you a few possibilities. One of them is I hope that some of you will get involved with COST as a volunteer. So talk with us after the meeting, explore ways to put your skills and energy to work. We are capacity constrained in terms of the number of projects that we can take on because of people, so your help really does matter. Secondly, for those of you whose situation permits, relative to your professional situation or whatever, for those of you who can do so, we'd like to encourage you to consider a donation. As I said, if you can give to the Cost Foundation, which focuses on research and education. You can do that tonight by credit card. Doug and Julia's here somewhere. Okay, see Doug and Julia, they're over there by the exit, or cash or check accepted at the reception table. And I also want to mention that we welcome stock contributions directly or through donor-advised funds, such as, for example, Marin Community Foundation, where we are on their approved list in their donor base. In addition, for those of you who support political change, please consider a donation to our 501c4, the Coalition of Sensible Taxpayers, i.e. without the word foundation at the end. It's not tax deductible, but it does give us more flexibility to use your funds for political activities like promoting candidates or tax measure positions, flyers, mailers, and things like that. And finally, I recognize that a number of you who are here are school administrators, fundraisers, tax measure campaign heads, and the like, and maybe you're not in a situation where you are able to donate or volunteer because of that. So we encourage you to work for change. One really important thing to do is be honest with your constituents about the budget squeeze that you're feeling. Don't deny it anymore. Tell people what's causing it and the harm that it's doing to our children's educations and to our most vital public services. Secondly, in some locations like Mill Valley and Ross, the community has tapped the local financial expertise in financial advisory committees, small committees, maybe 5 people who are really smart about finance, get them together to advise the district about, and the board about a 5 to 7 year plan and to make the most of the money that you have. And then thirdly, I want to just re-emphasize something that David said in his talk tonight, which is that you will be increasing taxes all the time unless you address the cost. You can't fundraise your way out of this. So that's the importance of trying to do what you can do at the local level. And it's also the importance of maybe stepping out of the box and lobbying with Sacramento for change. And I know I've had superintendents tell me they don't want to touch that. They feel that if they get involved in any way in speaking up to Sacramento, that that puts them in a worse position in terms of trying to recruit teachers and so on. But this is a problem that's not going to solve itself, and we need to tell Sacramento that doing nothing is not okay. So thank you all for your attention. This is the end of our program. Thank you all for being here. And just one last thing. David has generously volunteered or been coerced into hanging around a little bit. So if your question didn't get answered, he's still here, we're still here. Thank you. Oh, and by the way, there's only a tiny elevator, so you can go down the stairs if you're mobile.
Oh, thank you very much.